the very day my father died. The major tragedy in his day, the major tragedy in his entire life, was the Chicago Black Sox scandal. He was a mere stripling. He was living in the Chicago White Sox neighborhood. He lived on the south side of Chicago. He was a pool room type, He was hanging around the pool room and yelling and hollering and working as a messenger boy for Western Union and all that stuff. And the absolute light, the sun of his life, the moon, the universe, was down there at 35th and Shields, right in the heart of Chicago's teeming, festering south side, 35th and Shields, Comiskey Park. Oh, boy, old Comiskey Park would sit down there, and those old green walls, you'd see those stands standing up against. It was the biggest thing for miles around. You see, down on the south side of Chicago, they didn't have skyscrapers there, They just have a lot of tenements, and they had the stockyards. Everything is low there, you see. They had all these crummy little houses, these little brownstones and bungalows, and busted down fences and cobblestone streets. It was a steamy, fetid countryside. How many of you have ever read James T. Farrell's Studs Lonigan trilogy? Well, that was written and done during that day when my father was growing up on the south side of Chicago, and Lonigan, Farrell, Farrell was growing up in the same neighborhood at the same time as my father. Have you noticed that James T. Farrell, one of the great American writers, at least he's turned out a couple of great American books. Certainly the Studs Lonigan trilogy could be nothing but America. At least it was South Side Chicago. He has never gotten baseball out of his skull. Have you ever followed anything about Farrell at all, Mike? Well, Farrell, even to this day, keeps writing little books about baseball. And here's a guy, he wrote one of the great American classics, the Lonigan trilogy. And why? Well, you have to understand the south side of Chicago to understand why every man who grew up at that time in that section of the country, right there on the south side of Chicago, it was the only thing. It was the only thing that had any majesty, any grandeur, any drama in their whole life. I mean, they lived in pool rooms. They spent all of their evenings trying to steal wire from the Edison Company. Flip rides on the streetcars. That was about it. But down at the end of the street, guess what? Comiskey Park. Comiskey Park. That's where the Chicago White Sox played the New York Yankees. That was the one touch with fantasy, reality, defeat, and most importantly, victory. They were the only people in the whole neighborhood who ever won anything. Nobody won on the south side of Chicago, except the Chicago White Sox. They were first place in the American League. They were knocking the stuffings out of the Yankees. The Detroit Tigers weren't even in it with them. The Cleveland Indians, kid stuff. Shoeless Joe Jackson, the peerless center fielder. Yes, sirree. Buck Weaver, the sensational third baseman. The sensation of the entire league. Little lefty Dick Smith, the fantastic, tiny, left-handed pitcher who hurled for the White Sox. They were victorious all the way. They led the American League 3-4 straight seasons. And all those little pool players, all those little wire stealers, all those little guys who spent their evenings hooking rides on the back end of Chicago streetcars, every afternoon we're out there to see the only victory in their entire lives. Shoeless Joe lining one into the lower deck. And the thing about the Chicago White Sox ball players of that period is that they were like the guys who came to see them. They were all poor working men. They were not the kind of ball players that you see today. No, Shoeless Joe, do you know that Shoeless Joe Jackson, in his best year, the best outfielder in the whole of all baseball, the heaviest hitter, the best fielder, you would not guess how much this poor guy earned. $2,100 for a whole year. A simple guy from the simplest of all backgrounds, and that's why he was called Shoeless Joe. Shoeless Joe Jackson stood atop a pinnacle beyond all reason. at $2,100 poor, sad little dollars a year. And don't say that was a lot of money in those days. It wasn't. It really wasn't. Bartenders earned more than that. But Shoeless Joe would go drifting back near that fence in Comiskey Park with that easy, majestic grace of a born hillbilly who had spent all of his life going up and down mountains and crossing great plains without so much as even breathing heavy. Shoeless Joe would stick that skinny little glove up in the air and snag one of those hard, long, high shots up the bats of one of the New York Yankees, and without so much as even looking back, casually flip the ball from the lower deck to his fans. Shoeless Joe Jackson, the peerless Chicago White Sox outfielder. And then one evil, dark day, late in October, the Chicago White Sox are playing the Cincinnati Reds for the World Championship. And everybody in the Western Hemisphere knew that the Chicago White Sox could make mincemeat of these candy wastes without even so much as breathing heavy. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 majestic games were played. And the Chicago White Sox went down to ignominious defeat. And Shoeless Joe, out there in center field, kept chasing those balls around, making those long throws, and somehow it didn't look right. Somehow Buck Weaver wasn't going to his left like he used to. Somehow that fearless shortstop, a heavy, great jaw, the Swede at shortstop, somehow was just kind of missing those plays around second base, just by an eyelash. Yeah, things weren't right. My old man sat out there in Comiskey Park and watched. What's the matter, fellas? Hey, hey! In the good old summertime. La, da, 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 da. Okay. Now you have to understand the majesty, the incredulousness, the total disbelief of the entire city of Chicago, particularly the south side of Chicago, when it turned out, get me that ball game thing. Don't give me the summertime. Give me the ball game thing there. When it turned out late the following year that the Chicago White Sox had thrown the World Series. They had accepted money from evil gamblers from the East. New York Sharpies had come into town and bought out old Shoeless Joe, who didn't even know what he was doing, who bought out the Swede at shortstop, and 8 of the Chicago White Sox players had sold the entire South Side, the pool players, the flippers of rides on the back of Chicago streetcars, the guys that spent their nights stealing wire from the Edison Company just to get a few pennies together to go to see these guys. They had sold them down the river.